let's straight jump into it. So a little bit of background. Last year at DappCon, we had a panel about what could go wrong. And it basically tried to ask us the question, if this blockchain thing here is like technically successful, what could nevertheless go wrong to make it a, to make it a negative for society. So we tried to discuss risks. Joe was on the panel as well, and part of this panel then, the question came up, how to measure success, or in other words, what is the metric about society that should change in a positive way if we are successful. So why are we doing this, basically? I start a little bit probably easier with right now, most dApps probably have less users than there are currently people in the room. So are we successful? And if so, why are we successful? Or kind of what is the metric that we can currently observe that tells us that we are doing the right thing and that we are successful? Or are we not?
So I'll jump in. So the blockchain ecosystem is 10 years old. The smart contract ecosystem is arguably 5 years old. It is incredibly young as a technology and still quite immature as a technology. We built what we're considering to be a base trust layer and offering it to the world more conceptually than for the world to really anchor all of their applications into it yet. And we're now building out DeFi, open finance, financial plumbing for the emerging decentralized economy. Technologies take quite a while to develop themselves and to be adopted. So between when Tim Berners-Lee wrote his white paper and when there was actual ramification in society, it was at least 10 years. Mobile phones took a long time to catch on. If you remember those old satellite phones, and cars took a long time, and electricity took a long time. So this is happening remarkably quickly. When a technology first emerges, it's very raw. You can see the innards of the machine. You have to turn the crank yourself. You have to download extensions yourself. You have to deal with long strings of hexadecimal, and we're just getting to the point where we're figuring out user experience, user interface, usability. We're getting to the point where we're figuring out scalability and privacy and confidentiality. So right now, I think we have to measure user adoption by how many developers there are in the space, and so I think we're doing incredibly well. Those are the people that are going to fix all those problems. They're going to put the shell on the machine and make it really usable. And I think early on we realized that it's probably going to go well for a while, but until we hit some extreme friction in society, we won't really know that we've arrived. And so when the term shitcoin is spoken in a congressional hearing, I think we're starting to hit the mainstream in terms of awareness. And so I expect it to go fairly smoothly, but that's one measure right there that we will get societal pushback.
So the two metrics I heard is number of use of the term shitcoin and developers, right?
in official public settings, yes.
Okay.
I think the limits of like those kinds of metrics are that like one is awareness and the other is people trying to do things, and like it's clear that there is awareness and it's clear that there are people trying to do things, but the thing that I'm more kind of concerned about is getting from that, which I actually feel we have pretty comfortably, to people successfully doing things. Like, to what extent is this space like just people building products to help people gamble on future usage of the space, which is more people building products to help more people gamble on the future of the space, versus like actually providing a concrete value that they would otherwise not have gotten. And I think there are definitely kind of signs that valuable things are starting to genuinely happen. And for like some of the more institutional applications, there's actually starting to be used, like Ethereum being used for just even things like verifying certificates. Like that's happening, and that's a value that you can. And it's not the biggest thing, but it's value that you can see fairly easily. Like when I even just for cryptocurrency itself, when I visited Africa and I talked to some people in the local community, and I asked like how concretely are people there using blockchain things, and the reply I got is there's just a lot of people that are remotely working for companies based in rich countries, and they're able to work for them, and cryptocurrency just helps them move money to their families for a lot less than the like 15 point whatever percent commissions you would get with traditional services. So there's things happening that kind of aren't captured as being as being clearly the revenue of a particular company dedicated to that thing. And in some ways you should expect that, because crypto is supposed to be about reducing intermediaries. But I definitely feel like we're not good at measuring the extent to which those kinds of things are happening now and are close to happening.
You're all about measurements and metrics and data at Messari?
I don't necessarily know that we're bad at measuring these things. I think that you just might not like the metrics that we're ultimately looking at. Greed, for lack of a better term, is good in this industry, at least. And traditionally, investments in Bitcoin have led people down the rabbit hole and gotten them more actively involved in the ecosystem. And investments in Ethereum have been speculative in nature by many people that first approach the industry, and then that ultimately leads them further down the rabbit hole. And if you think about the only, in my eyes, 3 applications of crypto that have hit product market fit, it's money, originally with Bitcoin, which is kind of like a distributed central bank. It's ICOs and distributed crowdfunding, which is kind of like a distributed investment bank. And then more recently, it's lending, which is kind of like a decentralized commercial bank. So I would look for things like wallet addresses that hold $100, $1,000, $10,000 or more worth of these assets as probably the most important metric that the industry should track going forward, because as that number increases, more people will be fully hook, line, and sinker into crypto as an asset class, as an emerging tech space, because they have to put their money where their mouths are.
So the thing that grabbed my attention about blockchain and about Bitcoin originally was not securities law, wasn't whether or not the CFTC thinks Bitcoin or Ether is a commodity or not. It was about the notion that we could, I'm a lawyer, disputes lawyer, someone who sued insurance companies for many years. It was the notion that you could create contracts that couldn't be broken. And I think that, from my perspective, I think it's too early to apply a sort of a financial metric, and maybe my brain doesn't work that way. I'm not in the same business as the other folks on the panel. But for me, when I start seeing people actually building things that are beyond financial speculation, that allow me as a lawyer to confidently automate the performance component of contracts, I feel like are people familiar with the book Crossing the Chasm? It's a classic book on entrepreneurship. I feel like we are at, I think there are 5 stages in Crossing the Chasm. I feel like when you hear shitcoin in Congress, or when you see people in Congress lobbying for or pushing for good regulation, useful regulation, I feel like, I don't think Bitcoin or sort of crypto writ large, I don't think it's going to go away. And my partners have looked at me funny sometime in the last couple of years. They're like, are you still talking about that Bitcoin thing, right? But I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's too early to know what it's going to be in 20 years. So going back to Joe's observation about technology, the elevator this is interesting, but the elevator is something that was developed about 50 years before it was actually put into use. And the problem is people kept dying because they didn't have brakes. So it wasn't until somebody actually agreed to license the steam brake for elevators that you had the development of high-rises. I don't think that anybody, when they created the steam engine, imagined elevators or high-rise buildings. And I think what's interesting to me as a lawyer and someone who's interested in technology is trying to imagine future applications. So I don't think I can define what is going to be success in 20 years. I think I can predict with some degree of confidence that the technology itself, the notion of decentralized money, the notion of programmable money that is immutable-ish, I think that persists.
Just on this note, so on this note of full automatically executable contracts. So one way I think about, or I tend to think about things is the internet brought down the cost of submitting information by a factor of probably way more than 100. So an information as trivial as I like this photo, like a Facebook like, is now kind of possible to share this information. While before you wouldn't send a letter just to let someone know that you like this photo. With blockchain, kind of my concept is that we can bring down the cost of transactions, and that could, for example, mean just giving someone a share in your venture. That could, obviously be sending money, kind of a broadest term of transaction. Bring down this cost by a factor of 100, 1,000, and probably enable completely new things because this cost has gone so.
Well, you can
much
imagine,
down.
For example, Jaron Lanier wrote a wonderful book called Who Owns the Future, where he describes both the utopian and a dystopian vision of human data, either being able to monetize your personal data yourself or having that personal data being controlled by big companies, Facebook, Twitter, which I never use, Instagram, and so forth. So the question is, we can imagine a use of the technology that allows you to monetize personal data because the cost has gone down, but we don't know. I don't think anybody sitting in this room is going to know what it will look like in 20 years and if it will be a success.
But maybe to the others is bringing down transaction costs and explicit.
So one actually, Stephen, wanted to ask about one concrete example. So this isn't a contract between two parties in the traditional sense, right? But it's a contract within an organization. Organizations are contracts, right? So the Ethereum Foundation has the majority of its funds, about 600,000 plus Ether, in a 4 of 7 multisig between 7 parties that are fairly considered within the foundation to be trusted stakeholders. And it also has a rule that says any one of those 7 has the ability to withdraw a maximum of 1,000 ETH per day, so you don't have to incur high inconvenience for small transactions, but it protects us from losing everything. So would this count as an example of smart contracts being used to do non-trivial, interesting things to you?
So the multi-sig contract is a smart contract?
Yeah.
But the keys are in control of people.
Yes.
So you have, I was just talking to somebody before, like the interesting part of that is that you still have to, you said trusted people?
Yeah.
So there's still a human component to discerning who's trustworthy, who can be trusted with those keys, because a multi-sig contract can be an absolute nightmare if you have the wrong people involved. So I would say it's really no different in a way than having multiple physical keys to unlock a missile silo or to unlock a vault. There's nothing about that in and of itself.
But they're usually going to be people who are the counterparties of these agreements that you're contemplating. And I think what Vitalik is saying is that the business logic of the agreement is unassailable.
Well, you can do that with your bank.
But
More assailable,
treasury.
more assailable than
when
a
you say
guaranteed execution of a smart contract.
When you say unassailable, help me out. What do you mean?
The business logic of that smart contract is codified.
You need 4 of 7 and no one can withdraw more than 1,000.
The rules that they've defined.
I actually, well, agree. So like just trying to set up a legal structure, probably across continents with seven people to say, well, we together want to manage this money, and we want to give us those rules. That would probably cost you thousands of dollars to set up the appropriate legal structure for that. With Ethereum, you can now deploy a multisig for 50 cents or something like that.
But you can't deploy the part of it that says each key holder is going to keep their key in a particular way, or if so-and-so dies, so-and-so will have access. If you have 4 of 7, like what happens if 5 people are on a plane at the same time and they die? How do you...
Well, then it's only 1,000 Ether per day for that on.
So like the interesting question is, right.
2,000 Ether, I mean, each person can pull money out on a daily basis.
There is, I would agree, like the multi-sig is fascinating and is useful. Like the governance that surrounds that control is off-chain and has the same human complexity that lawyers and business people have been dealing with forever. I'm not sure the blockchain solves that, nor is it intended.
It's also, so I would agree that a major financial institution is probably equally solid in implementing that agreement right now. But as Ethereum gets bigger and more decentralized and more unstoppable, 10 months from now, 10 years from now, I think it's going to be much more solid than a financial institution populated by people.
Let's not get too deep into multisigs. But transaction fees are potentially still a way to measure success. So maybe kind of going a little bit back from the big 10-year, 20-year society question to like a shorter term, which blockchain is successful. Would you agree that the total amount of transaction fees like paid on a blockchain is a good indication for its success?
An economist would definitely say it's the most reliable and robust way to put a lower bound on how much value people are getting from the chain. It's, I mean, the thing it doesn't tell you is it doesn't separate between categories of usage, but I mean, it does definitely tell you that someone valued the transaction being on chain enough to pay 64 cents for it.
Yeah, and I think it's probably the most important metric as some of these blockchains inflation rates decline, right? So what does the security model look like for Bitcoin once the inflation rate drops below 1%, right? You're going to need transaction fees if the miners under the current structure are going to be incentivized the way that they are today. Yeah. Ethereum may be somewhat similar, even with the transition to proof of stake. But for non-money applications, I would argue that transaction fees or some type of network income is probably the only fundamental driver of value. Otherwise, most of these things are going to zero.
Yeah, the one kind of problem I have with us kind of socially agreeing to push that metric too hard is that it would incentivize like blockchain governance participants, and I'm using the term broadly, like including developers, including miners voting on the gas limit, like mining pools voting on Bitcoin block sizes, whatever. It would incentivize these participants to basically care more about extracting as much value out of transaction fees as possible, as opposed to maximizing people's ability to use the chain. And when you have a monopoly, which a blockchain kind of is, then like those two goals are very often easily in conflict.
Yeah, if that was an important metric for deciding the value or popularity of blockchains, I think Tron's transaction fees would go through the roof 10 minutes after that was decided.
Oh yeah, I forgot to even talk about the possibility of mining pools paying to themselves.
Yeah.
EIP 1559 is going to fix that, though.
So, but on that, that is an interesting point on the basically potential of rent extraction, I guess. So. Yeah, how do we prevent it? So if Ethereum is extremely successful and token securities, whatever stuff is all on there, how do you stop Ether holders from at some point no longer trying to keep fees as low as possible, but like just starting to extract rent?
I don't know if that's rent extraction, just because especially as there's more alternative blockchains to build on, competition is going to bring that into kind of a natural equilibrium, right? So it'll be part of the social contract of whichever the blockchain is that you're using, that, here's the equilibrium rate. Maybe it's, 1% of total network transaction value is going to be remitted to the stakers and the miners, validators, whatever you call them. But if it drops too low, people are going to lose interest. The chain becomes less secure. If it goes too high and it does look like rent-seeking behavior, then some developers might migrate to another chain to build their application. So I don't know, practically speaking, in a world in 5 years where there's half a dozen or more competitive smart contract platforms, that becomes a real issue.
And aside from competition, I think another thing that's important is that this is a big part of why I favor a kind of diverse and multi-stakeholder governance structure. So like if we just had coin votes as a way of deciding like pretty much any system parameters, then, yes, potentially like Eric Connor is going to grow devil horns on his head and he is going to lead a campaign of all of the major ETH holders voting to push the gas limits down to extract $50 transaction fees like we saw in Bitcoin 1.5 years ago, and we'll have that forever. But if you have a governance structure that kind of more naturally incorporates voices from core developers, major application developer stakeholders, users, then that could be naturally mitigated more.
And also, if a bad actor was able to capture the system in some way and seek rents on the system, we've been saying for a really long time that the mechanism of forking would keep us all honest, and if something untoward is going on the platform, then the platform can be forked.
Can it? I mean, I think it has become, or it will become incredibly more difficult than like 2 years ago.
More difficult than seeing the rates rise inappropriately?
Forks are hard now because if Ethereum forks now, then either on one of the two chains, the price of DAI is going to drop to 0, or it stays at 1 on both chains, and then I have no idea what just happened.
I think you would actually see, I think there's a non-trivial chance that there would be legal action. I think somebody would probably go to federal court in New York, or
I think so.
And try and stop it. There's already been, I'm dead serious, there are at least 2 lawsuits out there where, and they're kind of silly requests, but there are at least 2 cases where plaintiffs have asked courts to order forks. And I'm not sure that a court is going to do that in those cases, but if you start talking about forking, what's the total value of Ether at the moment? 20 billion? If you go to federal court and say somebody's going to do something to an asset that's worth $20 billion, a federal judge is going to listen to that. So I think that's sort of the that's sort of the external interesting. Like to me as a lawyer, that's the interesting factor. How would a judge look at Ethereum in that context? And I think actually, so one of the
so who does the judge tell to fork the
I mean,
platform?
that's a really good question. So like, what is it? Who is it? Do you bring the exchanges in? Do you order the exchanges to do things?
It's a lot of different independent actors.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, it's the miners.
Sure. So I think
but the exchanges would have to list tokens.
We'll have one of the measures of success. I look at it as more legal certainty about those questions, as opposed to speculating, is legal certainty that comes out of a certain amount of pain. I can't say from a volume transaction standpoint what constitutes success. I would think that when we can answer with reasonable certainty what that means, what that will look like, is it, will judge throw it out, who will be named, what will the result be? That will be a measure of maybe we've moved one step further across the chasm.
If you can't be sued, you're sufficiently decentralized.
Yeah, I think this fork discussion is super interesting, and I think, well, Maker is obviously one reason why it's hard, and I hope there will be many more. So ENS will hopefully be soon a big reason why it would be hard, because then you would need to decide, well, which chain do the name resolve. Like security tokens, once they are there and pay out dividend, and the question is, do they pay out dividend to those tokens or those tokens? So overall, my sense is that forks will be very unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, forking is mutually assured destruction, the wonderful governance mechanism that's kept the world so nice and peaceful for 75 years. Yay!
So, but if we assume,
Do you think that's true even as interoperability solutions mature? Right, so
the
Cosmos,
problem is that
parachains.
blockchains aren't just computation and data service providers, they're also registries. And it's that second thing that's a lot more, that brings the thorniness.
Well, how do you mean?
Like, a blockchain just is used as the root registry of, like, claims within the context of particular applications. And so if the thing splits in half, then it either breaks on one side, in which case other things on that side that depended on it also break, or it survives on both sides, in which case you get really weird economics happening. So, yeah, like splitting definitely gets thornier the more of interdependency you have.
Sure. So if it's ambiguous, I would agree that it's going to be an impossible situation to work out. But if there is a clear actor that has captured the system and all of the interacting participants on the system get together and say, hey, are you going to switch? Are you going to switch? Are you going to switch? Then I could imagine a very clean transition. These tokens represent a US dollar in a bank account. I'm running the company that makes that mapping. We're choosing this chain.
Yeah, I mean, just from looking at history with Bitcoin and its major fork and Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, I find it hard to believe that you'll see another major controversial fork of one of those chains. And instead, at least I believe it's more likely that specific applications or dApps will end up migrating chains.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we won't see a major Bitcoin fork in the next year or two?
People being people,
I mean,
I would expect like...
It's been happening.
The one thing...
Why would we see one?
Because people
no reason.
People and money equal conflict. It's true. I mean, that's a long history of being a litigator tells me that. So it might not make sense, and I will also tell you that you learn this if you spend time as a lawyer. People do stupid things that are against their economic interest. And that's game theory tells you that as well. Behavioral economics tells you that as well. So people don't always act in an economically rational fashion. So my prediction is that if there's a lot of money at stake and you have people who are ideological, you'll have forks, whether or not they make sense, whether or not they're mutual assured destruction. Looking into my oracle.
I have a few kind of shorter-term like success metrics, and I would just throw them in and see whether that is a goal, or would you say that that's a goal to optimize for, or of course not like put all effort into optimizing this value, but whether it's a valid metric. So one is just how many people have a wallet. So in Bitcoin, I sometimes hear the argument, it's obvious that not everyone on the planet could do a Bitcoin transaction. So the argument is, well, that's not even needed. They can have layer 2 solutions, which are custodial exchanges, basically, in that case. So would you say it is an explicit goal to have as many people as possible having a wallet or being able to self-custody?
Sure, but it's a little bit complicated if you're measuring or comparing different systems, because the Bitcoin addresses are essentially throwaway addresses when they're used and there's a change address. Just the comparison, Ethereum addresses are much more persistent in their usage.
I think if Mixer's Electroneto Cash become more prevalent, then we could see us moving toward like one address equals one user per application.
Yeah, I mean, that was the key metric that I mentioned before. How many people have $1,000 of crypto? How many people have 10,000, and so on? And that's how you get a better sense for the wealth distribution, as well as how many people are actually using this beyond just a novelty.
Yeah, so if you're looking for identity as represented by addresses, we could go up the stack a little bit and look at ENS or decentralized IDs, and when those things get persistently registered and they become utilized significantly, I think that would be an incredibly important metric.
Maybe the wallet question, how do we improve it? Or kind of what is needed that more people do it? Is it, do they need more reasons to have it, or should it be easier, both?
Do you mean Ethereum in general?
Or, well, crypto wallets.
I think just education in general, right? I think the UX still sucks for most applications, and most people don't really understand the messaging behind crypto, right? That's why Bitcoin has been so successful. It's extremely simple to understand. Yeah. Ethereum struggles with narrative, except for the narrative of if you want to build cool applications and you're a tinkerer and you're a developer, then all are welcome, right? And I think that's why you have the vibrant ecosystem of development and experimentation.
Yeah,
but from a user perspective, right, there is no narrative, right? So if you're taking the approach that you can't trust your central bank, you can't trust currencies, you can't trust your bank where you're keeping your deposits, then open up a Bitcoin wallet, have a little bit just in case. That's an extremely simple narrative, and I think that most people won't go the next step to educate themselves if they don't at least have that very simple starting point.
People don't care about pipes, right? They want product. So I would agree, sort of a product focus. You obviously need the pipes to have the product, but if I can drop a little bit of a snippet of JavaScript into my web app so that I can do payments using Stripe, I don't necessarily care how that works, but I know that I don't have to deal with credit cards. I know that that sort of functionality is being developed, but when you have that, I don't really care how it works necessarily. I know that it's peer-to-peer, which is cool. It means I know that Ryan and I can enter into a contract that can't be broken, and I've seen that work in the past. When you can start, I think that narrative, like a great story for me, and it's maybe if you've got a shovel, if you have a hammer, you see nails. Insurance policies that can't be broken. I mean, if you've ever had a claim with an insurance company, you know that they're much happier to take your premium than to pay claims. That sort of product, like check this out, like a life insurance policy, when you die, it will be paid, and it's because of this blockchain stuff. I think that's sort of, that to me it remains much more interesting than sort of pure currency payments, that programmability, when you can do that without having to understand solidity, perhaps.
I think the main challenge with this stuff is that basically any contracts that people make other than paying bounties for solving math puzzles, like just has to have a real world component that blockchains by themselves can't read. So I think there are going to be applications that are less than 100% trustless, and you'd expect them to those to be the majority, but it still needs to understand when we're getting real gains that don't go quite that far and appreciate them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Fair.
Then maybe I would again repeat the question from last year and asking if we are technologically successful, what could go wrong? In any way. So what are risks basically of this technology, or are there any?
All of the use cases that could actually reach more people than cypherpunks get captured by semi-decentralized or pretend decentralized centralized systems.
Once again.
Like basically all the use cases that aren't crazy cypherpunk stuff and that 7 billion people could legitimately be attracted to just get captured by things that are more centralized than we would like.
So basically the status quo. Okay.
I mean, I can allude to astrological signs, but no.
Is that cryptocurrency? I mean, what is that? The astrological sign that you're referring to, or do you not want to say?
Are you still thinking, or?
No.
Okay. Your processing power is normally a little faster, so figured I could speak. And maybe I'll piggyback off of what I think Joe was hinting at. I think one of the most terrifying things for any rational person that's in the ecosystem, certainly for regulators, and kind of existential type of threat to the financial system if everything goes as planned and this really takes off, is will you have a private money supply, right? So whether it's ZK snarks or Starks or any privacy enhancing technology that ultimately cloaks transactions and just who owns what and how money's moving, if that happens at massive scale and the market cap increases by orders of magnitude, now you have a sizable chunk, if not the entire global economy, running on shadow finance. That's completely untraceable. And I think
which is different from the way it works today?
the difference is that we haven't figured out governance of these systems. So if you are fine with crypto ultimately being governed by the Ethereum Foundation and the major stakeholders and the major miners, then that's one thing. But I think that as this technology grows more pervasive, as the impact on global finance becomes much more real, you're going to need actual governance. And you're going to have governments talking about this, and there's going to be treaties, and people will be involved in the
when
actual
monarchs
development
were running the world, the young upstarts were people who wanted democracy, and so it takes time to figure out those systems, to mature those systems, to harden those systems so that they work. And I think we're in the next phase of let's say a governance phase shift.
That transition happened before structured finance, which is
so
itself a big existential
very complicated
threat.
And sophisticated and interesting.
So like a really simplistic way of saying what could go wrong, I would say things that don't have an off switch. Complicated things that move value quickly, that we don't understand, that don't have an off switch, and that don't have governance that we understand. That could be a problem. And if you're talking about, like, let's think about this 20 years down the road, building stuff that you
So the internet doesn't have an off switch, really, except in some countries it may have an off switch. The internet, globally it doesn't really have an off switch. Does the internet have failure modes? Is Facebook a failure mode? Is the exploitation of personal information a failure mode? If it is, that's just an application on this infrastructure that regulators and society are having a discussion about right now.
Facebook can be turned off. Twitter can be turned off. Banks can reverse transactions. I'm not making a normative judgment either. I see the benefits of semi-autonomous or semi-autonomous financial structures. I get that. But you can still turn systems off. You can still reverse transactions. We still do understand how the financial pipes work. If we're talking about speculating, sort of a thought experiment, what could go wrong 20 years down the road, we could have systems that we don't understand that are, I'm not saying it would be easy to turn Facebook off, but we could do it. I'm not sure I like the idea of a world where we have systems that we can't turn off.
This is especially relevant.
Nobody groks the internet completely, and nobody can turn off the internet.
This is especially relevant to this panel since we're probably all in the top 50 for the assassination markets, right? So, well, at least, I'll speak for myself.
I'm just a simple country lawyer.
So, Ryan,
I'm not interested.
You brought up kind of the one direction that is full privacy. To some extent, there might also be the risk for the opposite direction, like kind of no privacy whatsoever and everything transparent, everything on the blockchain, all your financial transactions visible by Libra maybe, I don't know. Is that a risk, or do you think privacy technology is strong enough that this will definitely win?
I personally have a little bit more comfort over the middle ground, right? So using things like
but can we achieve it?
What's that?
Can we achieve the middle ground? I guess everyone agrees that the middle ground.
Well, on the one hand, if everything is anonymous by default, the entire system is anonymous by default, that seems like it's going to be too scary to get mass adoption. And in fact, you're already starting to see some countries that are just outlawing things like Zcash just preemptively. I think the other thing that you have to keep in mind, especially during this transition period, is how will you possibly work as an on and off ramp to legacy financial system and kind of the real world, if you will, if you don't have some ability to follow financial regulations, and you can't, point to at least who's acquiring these assets, even if they then take it and put it into their own hardware wallet and transact it elsewhere and move it through tumblers. So that, to me, I get a little bit more confidence that if you can regulate the edges and the system kind of in macro is somewhat transparent, that's probably a good thing. But in micro, it becomes much, much more difficult to trace any individual's transaction. I think that's kind of the holy grail in the middle ground that ideally we'd like to see.
There is historical precedent for middle grounds. We're working between basically regulation and core crypto-anarchic technologies working reasonably well. I'd point to copyright enforcement as being number one. And I'd even claim, and definitely strongly claim, the middle ground is superior to copyright people being able to do whatever they want. And there's arguments to be made it's superior to no copyright existing at all as well. So such things have happened.
So I think there's going to forever be a tension between transactions that are associated with an identity and transactions that you effectively can't associate with an identity or are pseudonymous. I think we're going to see it with respect to cryptography and regulation and other forces in our technology. But I think it will go beyond our technology if we end up building perfect systems for hiding identity. Somebody's going to build a technology, maybe it's nano drones that fly around and see the keystrokes that we type into our keyboards and record those things and report them back. And so there will always be people who want to do stuff in an undisclosed fashion, and there will always be people who want to see what they're doing.
Then maybe
Sleep tight.
coming back to the original question and asking, again about the positive case. So, and trying to point it down to a metric about society. So, what is a metric for society that you would like to see, improved by blockchain in 10 to 20 years? And if you don't want to point it down to a metric, then maybe just or what's your biggest hope maybe for the technology?
Human happiness.
Human happiness, right. And, well, then I guess how would blockchain improve human happiness?
I mean, it's a tool, right? I think it depends on the people who are building with it. I think the mistake is to assume that it's a, look, you can build a building with a hammer, you can also knock somebody over the head. The question is going to be the intentions of the people who are using it and the products they're trying to build. We don't know if it'll ultimately be a net benefit or a net detriment. I think we can reasonably expect that it's here, though. So that's up to the people in this room to a certain extent.
Problem is it's hard to quantify happiness objectively.
I
So I will go for much broader economic and political agency for people around the world, and I think we can get there because we've built this technology that enables us to build collective collaborative systems. I've been calling them topical global villages, where you get a group of people together, you build a blockchain-based system, you define some goals, you define membership rules, you raise money, you execute the work on the blockchain, and it can be in pursuit of cure of a disease or some other shared set of goals. I think we're going to be living, working, playing on these systems, and I think each of us will have stake in those systems. We'll probably own those systems through token ownership and staking, and we'll probably need that ownership in order to participate in different roles. And so we'll be voting and working on these systems.
Yeah, so in this direction, so that wasn't kind of my metric I chose last year was the number of things you're, like, let's say, interacting on a daily basis. So the coffee shop you're going to, and kind of increasing, the number of things you're interacting with where you also have a stake in. So you have some form of ownership. That would be for me kind of one of those metrics. Maybe Vitalik.
I like the phrase economic and political empowerment. And well, I think you said agency, but empowerment is good too. And in general, I feel like the ultimate goal here is to allow people and communities of people to be able to form institutions, applications, structures, whatever of different kinds, whatever you call them, to help them shape and improve their destinies. And that's a very broad and hard to measure, but also a very powerful thing.
Yeah. So another way,
saying happiness, basically.
Yeah.
Well,
sure.
it's a different. Actually, it's more specific than happiness, because happiness can potentially be provided by a big brother God that doesn't give you any choice in how you get it. But
So another way to
empowerment can't.
think about it and measure it potentially is to think about how much of an ownership or stakeholdership society we develop. And so if I have economic and political agency in these systems that I live within, then I'm effectively an owner of those systems, and it's really great that we're calling this next phase of evolution of blockchain systems staking systems, and that we're staking assets and our time and attention. As we move into a much broader ownership society, we'll have many more people with skin in the game, many more people grounded in things they care about. So many people will be working to protect and preserve and to grow those things rather than break those things down.
I'd like to see everybody own between $1,000 and $10,000 worth of Bitcoin and Ether. Going back to my metric that I think will lead to success.
7.6 billion multiplied by 1 to 10,000 between 7.6 trillion and 76 trillion market cap.
On the low end? On the low end, that's gold. On the high end, that's a replacement for sovereign currencies.
Depends how many times Bitcoin forks, though.
I said Bitcoin and Ether, Joe. I said Bitcoin and Ether.
All right. Thanks a lot. So I think we will open it for a short Q&A. So we can have a couple of questions, and I see. Oh, we need a mic. I see one right here.
Hi guys. I want to ask your opinion about the new DAO movements and specifically the for-profit DAOs. Do you think there's any realistic chance that it could work? Not Moloch DAO, but the new ones.
I haven't researched the specific structures called for-profit DAOs, and I mean, honestly, I've been liking the word DAO less and less because it has a very specific connotation about this kind of singleton thing that everyone works through, as opposed to kind of more broadly just thinking about how can we use smart contracts. So, and I think there are definitely ways in which smart contracts can be used to improve different profitable business activity. And I suggested DAICOs about a year and a half ago as one possibility. More recently, there was this post on ETH Research about something called public interest projects, where basically people stake money and then the interest from putting that money in compound automatically gets put to whatever projects you support, and you can take the money out at any time, so you're kind of never risking your principal, which is kind of DAICO squared in some sense, and I find that interesting. So, I mean, I definitely support kind of broad innovation in these kinds of structures, and I think some of them could be really useful.
So I would say that the concept of the DAO is interesting as a protocol governance mechanism, not as a replacement for an entity itself. So DAO projects that are not trying to swallow the ocean and as a consequence drowning or becoming the ocean, but pick specific elements of corporate governance that don't work and iterate on those. I think like the notion of sort of automating governance issues, that's another, for me, example of how do you use smart contract technology to automate performance. Those are the projects that are interesting, not the ones that try to recreate everything.
Yeah, we're going to have so many protocol-based open platforms or these topical global villages that I described earlier, and we're going to need governance. Early on, some of us were using the term decentralized organizations as distinguished from decentralized autonomous organizations. A decentralized organization has people in governance of it. A decentralized autonomous organization, you snip the cords and the people aren't really in control, and it's operating by some logic that you can't adjust anymore. We'll probably see some of those things at some point in the future. So I've never been a fan of the term DAO. But we're seeing interesting ones pop up now for charitable allocations, and I think we'll see lots of for-profit versions of them. Somewhere out there might be a person named Aaron Wright who runs a project called Open Law. The Open Law team has just put together a framework for legal DAOs. They call them LAOs, Legal Autonomous Organizations. And for your protocol-based open platform, you can now talk to Aaron and have a fully legal blockchain-based decentralized organization to govern your system, based in Delaware currently, but they're trying to figure out other jurisdictions also.
So quick question regarding the mixers and other protocols that are being built. So if we go ahead and launch the mixers on the mainnet, what are the, as a company or as an individual, what are the challenges you will have to face from the government or anywhere else? Technically it's doable, but I'm worried about the other pieces. So any advice to that?
Wait, so the question was like like governance or challenges from the government?
Government.
Government. Yeah, so I mean, this gets into this kind of area of law where, like, on the one hand, there's this kind of long-standing precedent that kind of code is free speech, and if you write code and you publish it, then there's kind of free speech protections around it. But on the other hand, like, the extent to which you can lean on that is not infinite.
Right, so there's a difference between writing stuff on paper on your computer and instantiating it or making it actually perform and do stuff. I'm not going to provide a legal opinion about the legality of mixers, but like creating a thing is different than running a thing. And if you operate a mixer and you're involved in somehow in money transmission, I mean, probably talk to a lawyer.
Yeah, I mean,
Which is different from using a thing.
Yeah, sure.
So I could set up a mixer based on code that you wrote, and if nobody ever used it, I probably wouldn't be party to any sort of illegal activity. But if I facilitated illegal activity, so it's really about what the actions are in specific jurisdictions.
yeah, I mean, my understanding is that like things that give you more risk, one is actually actively running a server, another is making money from it.
Yes, I mean, obviously if you're profiting from something that looks dodgy in the eyes of the law, it's maybe there's more risk than not profiting. It really, I mean, it's such an it depends. It's hard to answer that question with any,
And
it'll give you any certainty.
And if I run a mixer that is designed to anonymize ownership of game tokens potentially, so if there's a real good usage for it that's not illegal, and somebody happens to like clean their value token somehow, I might not be liable potentially.
Yeah, so I think why a lot of people like us find the space interesting is because we're very frustrated with the legacy financial system, and we think that it extracts a lot of value from the real economy for the actual benefit it brings, like moving assets from A to B or acting as a registry. So I see blockchains like Ethereum like a place where you can really design new systems to minimize this this extraction of value from the economy. But do you think that, talking about business models, do you think we as developers are kind of like altruistically making the world a better place, or do you think there's actually a place there to actually also for companies to make profit out of this minimization of the abstraction of value?
So the reason financial institutions are able to make money, inordinate amounts of money perhaps, is because they are centralized intermediaries, and they've imposed themselves into a situation, and they maximize the value that they take in any transaction, and the value of providing those services in a much more decentralized context is so that you can provide intermediation, but in a much more competitive landscape, so that you can't really engage in rent-seeking behaviors. Decentralized markets are, or these protocols will be a really good way of determining doing price discovery around the value of intermediation, because intermediation is often very valuable, whether it's done by a smart contract or a banker. It's just a question of paying the correct price for it. In terms of whether developers are doing it for altruistic reasons or profit-seeking reasons or both, I think you'll get a pretty broad spectrum.
It's very case-specific, because, and like this is, like the problem is, right, that like even going more broadly, that as we enter the information age, this kind of traditional economic model of like, I build a thing that's useful to you if you have it, and you buy it because you want to have it, doesn't really work so well, because a large portion of the things that are getting built are fundamentally, partially, or fully public goods. And so you're creating things where if you try to gatekeep it, then you're basically destroying a large portion of the value. And so, like, because the economic system itself doesn't create this this nice direct link where you give someone a thing and they give you money because they want the thing, you have to rely on business models that rely on something connected to the thing that you're building. And sometimes this creates mismatches, so like advertising revenue being the example that people talk about the most, but also it does mean that there's not going to be a universal answer that covers every sector. And like sometimes creating a coin is actually the right thing, sometimes creating a company that does some things but also sells some things is the right thing. Sometimes like just being a kind of charity and accepting grants from other people is pretty much the only kind of pure way to do it. It really depends on the case.
Okay, thank you. One last question.
Yeah, sure. Was it me? Yeah. Okay. The economical inequality is increasing a lot currently in the world, and you said before that you hope that blockchain would help improve economically agency and empowerment, but do you believe that blockchain will help reduce economically inequality or increase it even further than today?
So maybe to put even more into the question, right now the inequality in blockchain is probably larger than in the society?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Blockchain is not going to solve world hunger. It's not going to solve inequality. It's a tool. I mean, it depends on how people use it. I don't see anything about the technology that makes it more or less likely that the world will be a more just, fair place that will allow people to have more equal distribution of wealth. It's
reducing barriers between countries is probably one of the bigger things there.
But also sometimes reduced barriers makes people hate each other more. I mean, it depends on what you build. I don't think I'm being cynical. I don't think it's a panacea.
So I definitely believe that having a better trust foundation, having reduced barriers, having greater collaboration platforms will lead, as I indicated earlier, to greater agency, economic and political, for most people. And so I do believe that while pretty much all systems, including blockchain systems, start out with the value extremely concentrated amongst the one person or the two people that starts a company or something like that, we are achieving greater decentralization in our ecosystem, and as this stuff actually starts to get used, I think the value is going to spread out probably better than in the previous technological revolution, where the technologies that were brought forth enabled the people in control of those organizations to stack value higher than it's ever been stacked before. I think this time will be different, to use a phrase, and I think blockchain is a unique mechanism that will enable this.
Yeah, I think in a healthy capitalist system, it's not a bad thing if inequality goes up, provided that the bottom quartile of people have a higher standard of living than they did before whatever the disruptive technology was that entered. So this has been pretty consistent with every major technology shift, and during the transition, it can get a little messy and it can get chaotic and doesn't always look that good for the people that are disrupted, especially if they can't change jobs quickly enough. But the end result over time is that standards of living writ large end up increasing. I'll give a book recommendation, The Rational Optimist, by Matt Ridley. If anyone hasn't read it, I'd encourage you to, because there's a lot of doom and gloom, and we tend to focus on what are all the things that could go wrong, but generally speaking, living standards globally for centuries now has continued to get better and better, and technology has been a driver of that, and capitalism has been a driver of that.
I think I just have to add here that, well, I'm still naive and optimistic about it, so I still think stuff like universal basic income and inequality, or basically this technology could reduce inequality.
Yeah, so I feel like by today's metrics, I think things are going to get better in terms of how wealth is distributed in the world. But I also think with different technologies, we're going to get to the point where we do have all of our physical needs met, our survival needs, and we start to change what we value in society. If we start to configure our institutions, whether they're corporations or other, to maximize mental and physical health or societal health rather than GDP. I'm not talking next year, but maybe 20 years from now. We're in the U.S. and I was just in South Korea. A huge focus on social value as generated by corporations, and there's a big company in South Korea that has 50% of the bonuses paid to executives based on how much they're driving social value. So I think the discussion or the metrics have a chance of changing over time.
Okay, we are already getting lots of messages here that we are way over time. Thanks a lot, thanks all to you, and thanks a lot for the questions.